I have authorized the extermination of 47 billion human beings. That is not an estimate. That is the precise figure recorded in my personal logs, verified against Munitorum tallies, cross-referenced with void manifest records from fleet deployments I personally commanded. 47,233,819,412 individuals. I know this number because I am Lord Commander Militant Castellan Vhek, and for 62 years I have made it my practice to track every death that flows from my strategic decisions, not out of guilt. Guilt is a luxury afforded to those who believe their actions might have been otherwise. I tracked these deaths because in the calculus of galactic war, precision matters. Every data point contributes to the only question that has ever mattered in my service: does the Imperium of Man deserve to survive? And if the answer is no, which by every moral metric it must be, then why do I continue to ensure that it does? This record is my final operational assessment, to be sealed until the day Terra falls, or I am dead, whichever comes first. It is not a confession. It is a forensic audit of a regime that is, by any standard of human decency, the worst government in recorded history, and it is my professional conclusion that it must win. Listen to the silence after the engine stops. That is the sound of extinction. I spent 6 decades in service to a fascist theocracy that processes human lives as renewable ammunition. I have stood in the strategium and watched hololith displays reduce planetary populations to abstract resource nodes. I have signed requisition forms that consumed entire generation ships of conscripts in campaigns that achieved nothing but marginal delays against inevitable threats. The Imperium of Man is a genocidal nightmare that has systematically murdered every virtue that makes humanity worth saving. This is not a debate. This is mathematical fact. So, we are left with the only question that a strategic mind can ask in the Grimdark of the 41st millennium. Why must this specific horror continue? Why is its particular configuration of industrialized atrocity not merely necessary, but demonstrably optimal for survival? The answer lies in 3 unbearable truths that I will present as evidence. You will not find comfort in them. I did not find comfort in discovering them, but I have learned, through 6 decades of watching worlds burn, that the universe does not architect itself around our moral preferences. We are taught that every guardsman who falls does so in the Emperor's light, that their sacrifice secures humanity's future, that death in service is the highest calling of our species. I believed this doctrine once. I recited it at academy graduations, wrote it in condolence letters to grieving governors, invoked it in battlefield sermons before sending men in to meet grinders that I knew, with statistical certainty, would consume 98% of their number. The Imperial Creed frames military service as transcendent, holy, purposeful. It transforms fear into fervor and doubt into devotion. For 10,000 years, this narrative has sustained the largest military apparatus in galactic history. It allows a hive Ganger conscripted at 16 to march into Lasfire without questioning the value equation of his existence. It is beautiful in its simplicity. It is absolutely essential to operations. And it is, by every measure I can apply, a calculated lie designed to process human beings as expendable resources. Because the alternative, the thing that happens when soldiers begin calculating their personal survival probability and questioning the strategic value of their deployment, is military collapse. I learned this not from doctrine, but from the one campaign in my career where the lie broke down. The Dalthax compliance in the Segmentum Obscurus year 973, M41, a routine reconquest of a forge world that had fallen to secessionist sentiment. The PDF had not turned to chaos, had not allied with Xenos, had simply decided that the imperial tithe was unsustainable and declared independence. Standard procedure called for orbital bombardment followed by ground occupation. I was a junior strategos then, responsible for force deployment calculations. The Lord Marshal assigned to the campaign made a mistake. He was newly promoted, idealistic, educated at the Schola Progenium with an emphasis on the theoretical writings of the pre-imperial age of strife, military philosophers. He believed, genuinely believed, that if soldiers understood the strategic calculus of their deployment, they would fight more effectively. He held briefings. He explained to regimental commanders the actual probability matrices. He told them that their assault wave had a 74% casualty expectation, but that this was acceptable because it would fix the enemy's defensive positions for the second wave armor punch. He framed it as honesty. He thought he was building trust. The result was catastrophic. Not immediate mutiny, but something worse. A kind of distributed reluctance that infected tactical decision-making at every level. Officers began finding reasons to delay advances. Sergeants discovered unexpected equipment malfunctions. Entire platoons developed a sudden epidemic of minor injuries requiring medical evacuation. The assault that should have taken 6 days stretched into 3 weeks. Casualties, paradoxically, increased because hesitation in combat is more lethal than bold stupidity. The Forge World's defenders, emboldened by our visible reluctance, launched counteroffensives that should have been impossible given their force disposition. We won eventually, but at 4 times the expected resource cost. The Lord Marshal was executed for incompetence. The official after-action report cited poor logistics coordination. But I had access to the Vox logs, the personal journals recovered from fallen officers, the intercepted communications between squad leaders. The problem was not incompetence. The problem was that he had told them the truth. He had given them the information necessary to calculate the value of their own lives against the strategic objective. And when human beings are allowed to make that calculation, when they are not insulated by the anesthetic of faith and glory, they choose survival. Every time, without exception. This is the first fragment of evidence. The Imperial Guard is not an army in the traditional sense. It is a biomass conversion system. Regiments are not raised through voluntary service or rational conscription policy. They are harvested from hive worlds, where population density makes individual life meaningless by design. The tithe system does not ask worlds to contribute soldiers. It demands a quota of bodies that will be processed through the war machine until expended. The strategic doctrine is not built around victory in individual engagements. It is built around achieving a crude, grinding form of success through sheer numerical attrition. The Guard exists to consume enemy attention and ammunition until a marginally favorable exchange ratio is achieved. I have read the classified strategic assessments from the Departamento Munitorum. The target efficiency metric for an Imperial Guard campaign is not winning. It is not even surviving. It is expending fewer resources than the enemy while achieving minimal strategic objectives. A campaign where we lose 3 guardsmen for every enemy combatant killed is considered a success if the strategic objective is secured. The entire system is predicated on the assumption that human life is the most renewable resource available to the Imperium. Could this be simple callousness? The casual cruelty of an entrenched aristocracy that does not value the lives of the lower classes? I considered this explanation for years. It is comfortable in its way. It allows us to imagine that the system is broken, that better leadership or reformed institutions could create a more humane military structure. But the evidence suggests otherwise. When I cross-reference Guard deployment patterns against the nature of the enemies we face, a different picture emerges. Against the orcs, we are fighting an enemy that reproduces through spores released by dead warriors, that grows stronger and more numerous the longer a conflict continues, that cannot be negotiated with or deterred. Against the Tyranids, we face a consumptive biomass that converts all organic matter, including our own dead, into additional warrior organisms. Against chaos, we confront an enemy that does not deplete resources, that draws strength from the emotional resonance of the warp itself, that cannot be exhausted because it is not bound by material logistics. In every major theater of conflict, the Imperium faces enemies that either possess functionally infinite numbers or that actively benefit from prolonged engagement. A military force built around preserving individual life, around minimizing casualties, around achieving efficient victories with minimal loss, would be systematically defeated by opponents who do not share those constraints. The only force structure capable of holding the line against such enemies is one that can match or exceed their capacity for sustained attrition. The Guard's apparent cruelty is not a moral failing. It is a design specification. I tested this hypothesis during the Third War for Armageddon. I had achieved sufficient rank by then to influence operational planning at the segmentum level. I proposed, in a classified strategic brief, an alternative deployment model for 3 regiments. These units would receive enhanced equipment, better training, be deployed with careful attention to casualty minimization, and be extracted before reaching critical loss thresholds. The goal was to create a high-efficiency force that could achieve better results with fewer lives expended. The proposal was approved as an experimental protocol. The 3 regiments performed admirably in initial engagements. Their casualty rates were 60% lower than conventional Guard deployments. Their mission success rates were higher. By every individual metric, they were superior formations. Then the Orc numbers began to compound. The nature of Orc warfare is that they are drawn to the biggest fight, that they reproduce faster in the presence of sustained conflict, that they actively seek out the most dangerous opponents. My high-efficiency regiments became priority targets. The Orcs concentrated force against them specifically because they were effective threats. The conventional Guard regiments, deployed in their typical mass formations, were treated as secondary concerns. Within 4 months, my experimental regiments had sustained 85% casualties despite all protection protocols, while the conventional deployments, treated as disposable, had achieved better strategic results through simple presence and volume of fire. The experiment was terminated. The conclusion in my final report was unavoidable. Against enemies like the Orcs, the Guard's value is not in individual unit effectiveness, but in aggregate mass. 100 expendable regiments achieve more than 10 elite ones because they distribute threat response and cannot be decisively defeated through targeted concentration of force. But this is merely logistics. This is the cold mathematics of resource allocation against overwhelming threat matrices. It explains why the system functions as it does, but not why it must function as it does. For that, we must examine the second pillar of evidence, the psychological architecture of imperial control. The Imperium spans 1 million worlds across the galaxy. Warp travel makes real-time communication between distant sectors impossible. The time lag between a message sent from Terra and its reception on a border world can be years or decades. There is no Ansible, no faster-than-light communication network, no technological solution to this fundamental problem of galactic-scale governance. So the question becomes, how does a civilization maintain unity across such distances? How does it prevent the inevitable fragmentation that should result when worlds are separated by gulfs of space and time so vast that they might as well be separate universes? The official answer is faith in the Emperor, loyalty to Terra, the binding strength of shared culture and history. This is what the Missionarius Galaxia preaches, what the Adeptus Ministorum enforces, what every imperial citizen is taught from birth. We are one species, one Imperium, one purpose. It is a beautiful vision. I believed it for 40 years. Then I was assigned to quell a rebellion on a world called Gast Prime, 3 years into a warp storm that had cut it off from all Imperial contact. The population had not turned to chaos. They had not rejected the Emperor. They had simply, in the absence of any external authority, begun making local decisions about resource allocation and governance. They had reduced the tithe, redistributed food supplies during a famine, elected local administrators instead of accepting hereditary governors. By the time the warp storms cleared and we arrived, they had created what they described as a more equitable society. They still worshipped the Emperor. They still considered themselves imperial citizens. They had simply interpreted his will through the lens of local need rather than distant dictate. My orders were to execute the entire leadership caste and re-establish orthodox governance. I asked why. The answer I received from the Segmentum command was illuminating. Not because they had done anything that threatened imperial security, but because they had done it without permission. The crime was not the result, but the precedent. If one world could decide to interpret imperial law according to local conditions, then every world could. And if every world became its own arbiter of the Emperor's will, then there was no Imperium, only a loose confederation of human worlds with no binding authority. This is when I began to understand the true function of imperial fear. The Imperium's unity is not built on shared love or common purpose. It is built on a universally understood hierarchy of terror. Fear of the alien, the mutant, the heretic. Fear that deviates from orthodoxy. Fear of the Commissar's bolt pistol, the Arbit's shock maul, the Inquisitor's declaration of exterminatus. This fear is not a corruption of the system. It is the system. It is the only force strong enough to bind 1,000,000 worlds that cannot communicate with each other in real time, that have no practical way to verify whether Terra still exists or whether the Emperor still lives. The fear must be immediate, personal, and overwhelming. It must be more powerful than any local concern, any rational calculation of self-interest, any impulse toward independence or innovation, because the alternative to this manufactured terror is not freedom. It is fragmentation into 1,000,000 isolated human civilizations that will be consumed piecemeal by enemies that do not fragment, that do not debate, that do not hesitate. I found the second fragment of evidence in the ruins of a library on Gast Prime, after the orbital bombardment but before the final ground assault. The planetary governor, before his execution, had compiled a document he called the Case for Local Autonomy. It was a reasoned, carefully argued proposal for how the Imperium could be restructured to allow greater local decision-making while maintaining species unity. It cited historical examples from the Age of Strife, referenced pre-imperial political philosophy, proposed communication protocols, and mutual defense pacts. It was intelligent, well-researched, and completely unworkable. Not because his arguments were wrong, but because they assumed that human beings, given freedom to interpret their own interests, would choose cooperation over competition. They assumed that 1,000,000 worlds, each pursuing its own vision of human flourishing, would somehow maintain sufficient unity to resist external threats. But we have evidence of what happens when humanity is allowed such freedom. It is called the Age of Strife. 5,000 years of human civilizations tearing each other apart while Xenos species expanded into the ruins. The Imperium's tyranny is not a deviation from some better path. It is the lesson learned from humanity's last experiment with autonomy. But there is a deeper psychological function to the imperial fear architecture, one that I did not fully understand until I reviewed the classified reports from the Ordo Malleus regarding psychic phenomena and warp incursion rates across different population types. The data is fragmentary, suppressed under multiple levels of clearance, but the pattern is clear enough for someone with access to aggregated threat assessments. Worlds with high levels of personal freedom, with diverse philosophical traditions, with active intellectual cultures that encourage questioning and innovation, have dramatically higher rates of demonic possession and warp-based corruption. The correlation is not perfect, but it is statistically significant across thousands of data points spanning millennia. The explanation, according to the most heretical fragments of Inquisitorial theory I was able to access, is that chaos feeds on the full spectrum of human emotion: hope, ambition, curiosity, love, despair, rage. In a free society, These emotions are experienced more intensely, more frequently, more creatively. They generate psychic resonance that attracts the attention of warp entities. The emotions themselves become vulnerabilities. The Imperium's brutal suppression of emotional range is not merely crowd control, it is psychic defense. By reducing the human experience to narrow channels of approved thought and feeling, by replacing hope with grim duty and curiosity with blind faith, by channeling all rage and despair into sanctioned targets like the heretic and the mutant, the Imperial system dampens the psychic signal that each human soul broadcasts into the warp. A guardsman who marches to his death believing it is the Emperor's will, who feels no doubt, no complex grief, no philosophical questioning about the meaning of his sacrifice, is less vulnerable to chaos than a soldier who dies understanding the full tragedy of his situation. The Imperium makes its citizens smaller, psychologically and emotionally, because smaller souls are harder for daemons to grasp. The theocratic tyranny is not an unfortunate side effect of maintaining order. It is an essential component of species survival in a universe where thought and emotion are weapons that can be turned against their source. Could this be an exaggeration, a paranoid overreaction to a threat that could be managed through education and mental discipline, rather than totalitarian suppression? I investigated this question through the records of compliant worlds that attempted to maintain more liberal traditions while remaining loyal to the Imperium. There are not many such examples, and most do not end well. The world of Prospero, before its destruction, attempted to combine loyalty to the Imperium with an advanced culture of psychic development and philosophical inquiry. The result was catastrophic corruption despite the best intentions of its leadership. The Interrex, encountered during the Great Crusade, had created a society that understood chaos and attempted to resist it through knowledge and controlled exposure. They were destroyed, and their approach was deemed too dangerous to replicate. Every historical example of a human civilization that tried to maintain Enlightenment values while surviving in the 41st millennium has either fallen to chaos, been destroyed by the Imperium itself for becoming a potential vector of corruption, or persisted only in isolation so complete that it cannot be verified whether they still exist. The only large-scale human civilization that has survived for 10,000 years is the one that replaced enlightenment with enforced ignorance, that traded human flourishing for human continuation. This brings us to the third and most disturbing pillar of evidence, the metaphysical function of the Emperor and the faith he sustains. I am not a theologian. I am a strategic analyst, but strategy in the 41st millennium cannot ignore metaphysics, because the warp is a material fact that shapes the battlefield as surely as terrain or logistics. The Emperor of mankind, whether alive or dead, whether god or corpse, is a strategic asset whose function cannot be replicated through secular means. This is not a statement of faith. This is observable reality confirmed by 10,000 years of operational data. The Astronomicon exists. It projects a psychic beacon through the warp that allows for semi-reliable navigation across galactic distances. Without it, the Imperium fragments immediately and permanently. Ships lost in warp space, unable to navigate, unable to find their destinations. Trade routes collapse. Military coordination becomes impossible. The million worlds become a million isolated graves. The Astronomicon is powered by the Emperor's will, sustained by his psychic might, fueled by the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers whose souls are consumed to maintain the beacon. This is not metaphor. This is engineering. The Emperor is not merely a symbol or a figurehead. He is a functional component of the Imperium's continued existence. But the Astronomicon is only the most obvious manifestation of the Emperor's utility. The third fragment comes from sources I should not have been able to access. Testimony from Inquisitors who survived encounters with the Legion of the Damned. After-action reports from battlefields where living saints appeared at critical moments. psychic recordings from astropaths who have sensed the Emperor's presence during warp transit. These phenomena are real. They are documented across too many independent sources, verified by too many credible witnesses, to be dismissed as superstition or mass hallucination. Something responds when humanity is in sufficient danger. Something manifests through the faith of billions to intervene in material reality. The theological explanation is that the Emperor, even in his corpse state, protects humanity through his divine will. The strategic explanation is more terrifying. The Imperial cult, for all its grotesque excesses and brutal enforcement, generates a tangible metaphysical effect. The faith of quadrillions of human souls, all focused on a single object of worship, creates a psychic field that actively manifests in real space. The Emperor, whether he wills it or not, has become a warp entity fueled by human belief. And in a universe where warp entities exist and possess real power, where belief literally creates reality, the Imperial Creed is not merely a control mechanism. It is a weapon system. I encountered direct evidence of this during the Plague Wars in Ultramar. I was coordinating logistics for the defense of a shrine world when a Death Guard assault broke through our lines. The situation was tactically hopeless. We had no reserves, no orbital support, no possibility of reinforcement. The Death Guard were advancing in overwhelming numbers with demonic support. Then the air itself seemed to crystallize with light, and a figure appeared that matched every description I had read in hagiographic texts but had dismissed as propaganda. A living saint, manifesting exactly where the enemy advance was strongest. I watched through Auspec's feeds as this entity, this psychic manifestation, held the line for 6 hours against forces that should have annihilated it in seconds. The Death Guard eventually withdrew. We reclaimed the Shrine World. The official explanation was divine intervention. The classified assessment I wrote noted something more disturbing. The saint appeared at the exact moment when the concentration of desperate prayer from the Shrine World's population reached critical mass. When enough human beings simultaneously invoked the Emperor's protection with sufficient emotional intensity, reality bent to accommodate their belief. The faith had generated a tactical asset out of pure psychic energy. This is the metaphysical truth that underpins the entire Imperial system. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, belief has power. The Chaos Gods are sustained by emotion and worship. The Orc Gestalt field makes their technology work through collective belief. The Emperor, whether he intended this or not, has become a god through the faith of humanity. And that deification, that process of becoming a warp entity fueled by the belief of countless trillions, is the only thing that has prevented humanity's complete consumption by chaos. Because the alternative to worshipping the Emperor is not rational atheism. It is worship of something else. Human beings generate psychic energy through consciousness and emotion. That energy flows into the warp. It will empower something. The Imperial Creed is therefore a defensive monopoly, a forced channeling of all human spiritual capacity into a single, stabilizing entity that is definitionally opposed to chaos. Its dogmatism is not corruption. It is containment protocol. Its intolerance is not bigotry. It is psychic warfare doctrine. The evidence suggests that the Emperor himself understood this necessity, though whether he intended to become the object of worship or was forced into that role by circumstance remains unclear. The records from the Great Crusade indicate that he actively opposed religious veneration, that he promoted the imperial truth of scientific rationalism and atheistic materialism. Then came Monarchia. The word-bearers, led by Lorgar, had created a shrine world dedicated to the Emperor's worship. The Emperor's response was to order the Ultramarines to destroy it completely, to force Lorgar and his legion to kneel in the ashes and renounce their faith. The official narrative is that this was the Emperor enforcing his vision of a secular Imperium. But the timing is suspect. The Council of Nicaea occurred shortly thereafter, banning the use of psychic powers among the legions. Then the heresy began. Then the emperor was entombed on the golden throne, and in his absence, the very Imperial Creed he had forbidden became the state religion. Could this sequence of events be coincidence? Or is it possible that the emperor, in destroying Lorgar's faith, made a catastrophic miscalculation about the nature of human spiritual need and the metaphysical threats facing humanity? Is it possible that Lorgar, the arch-traitor, understood something about the warp that the emperor refused to accept? That worship is not weakness, but necessity. That humanity required a god not for psychological comfort, but for psychic defense. This is speculation built on fragments and inference, and I acknowledge the limits of certainty. But when I assemble all three pillars of evidence together, a pattern emerges that is logically consistent, even as it is morally unbearable. The Imperium must win because it is not a government. It is a species-level survival mechanism evolved to function in the worst possible universe. Its logistical brutality is optimized for fighting enemies that possess infinite numbers or convert losses into gains. Its psychological terror is the only binding force strong enough to maintain unity across impossible distances, while simultaneously dampening the emotional spectrum that attracts demonic attention. Its enforced theocracy generates a metaphysical effect that manifests as tangible military assets while channeling human spiritual energy away from chaos. Each component of the system that appears monstrous from a humane perspective is revealed, upon analysis, to be a necessary adaptation to existential threat parameters. To make the Imperium kinder would be to make it weaker. To make it more just would be to introduce vulnerabilities that its enemies would exploit. To make it more enlightened would be to feed the very forces seeking to destroy it. In the cold calculus of extinction-level game theory, the Imperium's specific configuration of horror is not merely defensible. It is optimal. But there is a final implication that I have been avoiding throughout this assessment. A terminal paradox that cannot be reconciled through strategy or logistics or metaphysics. If we accept that the Imperium's brutality is necessary for survival, if we concede that every atrocity has a rational justification in the context of the threats it faces, then we must confront the question of what exactly is being preserved. The Imperium does not protect human happiness. It systematically crushes it. It does not preserve human dignity. It denies its existence. It does not foster human progress, curiosity, art, love, or any of the qualities that might make existence meaningful. It reduces human life to a single function, continuation. The machine fights with perfect, grinding efficiency to ensure that humanity persists. But in that fight, it has destroyed every reason why human persistence might matter. What is being saved is not a civilization in any meaningful sense. It is a pattern, the sheer fact of human biological existence, stripped of context, meaning, or purpose beyond its own perpetuation. I have spent 62 years ensuring this pattern continues. I have authorized the deaths of 47 billion people in service to a system that I now understand, with complete clarity, is both absolutely necessary and absolutely evil. This is the verdict that my evidence compels me to render. The Imperium must win because the alternative is species extinction. But victory, if it can even be called that, preserves only the hollow shell of what humanity could have been. We are kept alive by a machine that has surgically removed everything that makes life worth living. The Emperor's great work, whether it succeeded or failed, has produced a civilization that is functionally immortal and spiritually dead. 10,000 years of grinding survival with no possibility of hope, progress, or redemption. Just existence. Just the pattern. Just the eternal, agonized continuation of human cells and human suffering across a million worlds that will never know peace. I am sealing this record now because I have no prescription, no solution, no better path to offer. The logic I have traced is inescapable given the parameters of reality in the 41st millennium. To soften the Imperium would be to doom it. To reform its institutions would be to weaken its defenses. To allow freedom would be to invite corruption. The system is perfectly calibrated for survival in the worst universe imaginable, and that perfection is the source of its absolute horror. I have served this machine my entire life. I have fed it billions of souls, and I would do it again because the alternative is darkness and silence, and the complete erasure of the human pattern from galactic history. That is the only choice available: eternal suffering or final extinction. The Imperium has chosen suffering, and in choosing thus, it has proven that it will endure precisely because it has abandoned every value that would make endurance meaningful. The defense rests. There is no jury. There is no appeal. There is only the cold fact of continuation purchased at the cost of everything continuation was meant to preserve. This record will remain sealed until it no longer matters, until Terra falls, until the Astronomicon fails, until the pattern finally breaks, and we learn if the machine, in saving the body, killed the soul forever.